The candles had barely been lit when Duke Alistair Whitmore raised his hand and stopped the footman from clearing the 12th chair. 11 guests sat at the long table inside Thornbury Hall, their voices rising and falling with laughter, their glasses catching the golden light. But one seat remained untouched. No plate, no wine glass, just a chair, pushed neatly against the table, waiting for someone who was not there. "Your Grace," the footman, Peter, said quietly, leaning close so the guests would not hear. "Shall I remove the extra setting?" "No," Alistair said, his voice low but firm. "Leave it." Peter hesitated, then stepped back into the shadows near the wall, exchanging a glance with Mrs. Bell, the housekeeper, who stood near the door with her hands folded. She had seen this every single night for 3 years. She never asked why. She had stopped asking a long time ago. Down the table, Lord Harrington leaned toward his wife and whispered something behind his napkin. Lady Grace, seated beside him, glanced toward the empty chair with open curiosity, before quickly looking away when she noticed Alistair watching her. The Duke did not explain himself. He never did. To his guests, the empty chair was simply one of his strange habits, something whispered about in drawing rooms across the county. Some said it was a memorial to his father. Others claimed it was superstition, a old family custom passed down through generations. No one dared ask him directly. His silence was famous. His temper, though rarely shown, was famous too. But the truth was far simpler, and far more painful, than any rumor. 3 years ago, a woman named Eleanor Vane had sat in that very chair every evening for nearly 2 years. She had eaten dinner across from him, argued with him about books, laughed at his dry jokes when no one else understood them, and challenged him in ways no one in his life ever had. And then, one night, she was gone. No warning, no note, no goodbye. Alistair looked at the chair now, and for a moment, the noise of the dinner party faded into the background. He could almost see her there, the way she used to sit with her back too straight, the way she would tilt her head slightly when she disagreed with something he said, which was often. "Alistair," came a voice beside him, pulling him back into the room. It was his cousin, Edward, seated to his right. "You have gone quiet again." "Forgive me," Alistair said, forcing a small smile. "I was thinking of something." "Or someone," Edward said, lowering his voice so only the Duke could hear. Alistair did not answer. He reached for his wine glass instead, if only to give his hands something to do. The dinner continued. Course after course was brought out by the staff, each one more elaborate than the last, prepared for a Duke who barely tasted his food most nights. Conversations drifted from politics to the upcoming harvest, from a scandal involving a neighboring family to the latest fashions arriving from the city. Alistair nodded when necessary, answered questions when asked, and smiled at the appropriate moments. He had become very good at appearing present while being somewhere else entirely. It was near the end of the meal, as dessert was being cleared and the guests began rising to move toward the drawing room, that Mr. Higgins, the butler, approached the head of the table with a small silver tray. On it sat a single envelope. "Your Grace," Higgins said quietly, "this arrived for you this evening. I did not wish to interrupt the dinner." Alistair glanced at the envelope, and his entire body went still. He knew that seal. It was pressed into pale blue wax, a small flower with delicate petals, a design he had not seen in 3 years. His hand hovered over the tray for a moment before he picked it up, his fingers suddenly unsteady. "Thank you, Higgins," he managed to say. "That will be all." The butler bowed and withdrew, leaving the Duke alone at the head of the table, the last of his guests drifting toward the drawing room, their laughter echoing faintly down the hall. Alistair remained seated, staring at the envelope in his hands as though it might disappear if he looked away. He turned it over slowly. There was no return address, only his name written in a handwriting he had not seen in years but would have recognized anywhere, the careful loops of the letters, the slight slant to the right. He had once told her that her handwriting looked like poetry, and she had laughed and called him ridiculous. His heart pounded as memories rushed back all at once, memories he had spent 3 years trying not to think about. Eleanor Vane. He had told himself, over and over, that she had simply grown tired of him, that she had found something better, someone better, somewhere far from Thornbury Hall. He had told himself that the connection they shared had meant more to him than it ever had to her. It was easier to believe that than to accept that she had simply vanished without explanation, leaving behind nothing but an empty chair and a silence that had never truly lifted. He rose from the table, the envelope clutched tightly in his hand, and walked toward his study, ignoring the sound of his guests enjoying themselves in the next room. He needed to be alone. Whatever this letter contained, he did not want an audience for it. Inside his study, he closed the door and leaned against it for a moment, his breathing unsteady. The room was dim, lit only by the fireplace and a single lamp on his desk. He crossed to the desk, sat down slowly, and placed the envelope in front of him. For a long moment, he simply stared at it. 3 years of silence, 3 years of wondering, 3 years of setting an empty chair at his table every single night, as though some part of him still believed she might walk back through the doors of Thornbury Hall and take her place beside him again. His fingers trembled slightly as he picked up the letter opener from his desk. He hesitated once more, his mind racing with questions he had asked himself 1,000 times before. Why had she left? Where had she gone? Had she ever cared for him at all, or had it all been in his imagination? He broke the seal. Inside was a single folded page, the paper slightly worn at the edges, as though it had been carried a long distance or held for a long time before being sent. He unfolded it carefully, his eyes moving quickly over the first line. His breath caught in his throat. The handwriting was unmistakably hers, but it was weaker than he remembered, less steady, as though the hand that had written it had grown tired. "My dearest Alistair," it began, "if you are reading this, then I have finally found the courage I lacked 3 years ago." He read no further before setting the letter down, his hand pressed to his chest as though to steady his own heartbeat. Outside his study, he could hear the faint sound of laughter from the drawing room, the clinking of glasses, the ordinary sounds of a dinner party continuing on without him. But inside this room, time seemed to have stopped entirely. 3 years of unanswered questions sat folded on the desk in front of him, waiting to finally be answered. He picked the letter back up, his eyes scanning further down the page, and what he read next would change everything he thought he understood about the woman who had once sat across from him at dinner, in the chair that had remained empty ever since. But before he could finish reading, a soft knock sounded at the study door. "Your Grace," came Higgins's voice from the other side. "Lord Harrington has asked to speak with you before he departs." Alistair closed his eyes briefly, torn between duty and the desperate need to know what the rest of the letter said. He folded the page carefully, slipping it into the inside pocket of his coat, close to his heart, and rose from his chair. "Tell him I will be there shortly," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. He glanced once more at his desk, where the envelope still lay, the pale blue wax seal broken now, the flower pressed into 2 pieces. 3 years of silence had finally ended, and somehow, he understood, without yet knowing the full truth, that his life was about to change in ways he could not yet imagine. As he walked back toward the drawing room to bid his guests farewell, his mind was no longer present at all. It had traveled backward, years into the past, to a quiet library and a governess with sharp eyes and a sharper tongue, to the beginning of everything that had led to this single, unbearable night. He would finish the letter. He would learn the truth. But first, his memory pulled him back to where it had all started, to the woman who had once made an empty house feel like a home, and to the reasons why he had never been able to forget her, no matter how hard he had tried. It had begun 5 years earlier, in the early spring, when Alistair's sister Margaret passed away after a long illness and left behind 2 young children who suddenly needed a governess. Alistair, still grieving and unprepared for the responsibility, had left the matter entirely in the hands of his mother, the Duchess Helena Whitmore, who took pride in controlling every detail of Thornbury Hall. The Duchess had interviewed several candidates before settling on a young woman named Eleanor Vane, the daughter of a respected but modest family from the northern counties. Eleanor's father had been a schoolteacher, well regarded but not wealthy, and her mother had passed away when Eleanor was young. She had grown up reading every book she could find, teaching herself languages and mathematics long before she ever taught anyone else. Alistair remembered the day she arrived at Thornbury Hall with painful clarity, though at the time he had barely paid her any attention at all. He had been standing in the entrance hall, discussing estate matters with his steward, when the front doors opened and a young woman stepped inside, carrying her own modest trunk, despite the footman's attempt to take it from her. "I can manage, thank you," she had said to Peter, her voice calm but firm, before glancing briefly toward Alistair and offering a polite nod. "Your Grace." "Miss Vane," he had replied, barely looking up from his papers. "Welcome to Thornbury." That had been the entirety of their first conversation. He had not thought of her again for nearly 2 weeks. It was the library that changed everything. Alistair had a habit of retreating to the library late in the evening, long after the household had gone to sleep, to read in peace without interruption. One night, nearly a month after Eleanor's arrival, he entered the library expecting solitude, and instead found her curled into the window seat, a book open in her lap, a single candle burning beside her. "Miss Vane," he said, startled. "I did not expect anyone to be here at this hour." She looked up, entirely unbothered by his presence, which surprised him more than anything. Most people in his household treated him with careful deference, always aware of his title, always choosing their words with caution. Eleanor simply closed her book, marking her place with a ribbon, and offered a small, unapologetic smile. "I could say the same of you, Your Grace," she said, "though I suspect this is your library, and therefore your right to be here whenever you please." "It is," he agreed, amused despite himself. "And what, may I ask, are you reading that requires such secrecy?" She lifted the book slightly so he could see the cover. It was a heavy philosophical text, one that few in his acquaintance would have chosen for leisure reading. I think more clearly at night," she said. "During the day, there are children to teach and household matters to attend. At night, the house is quiet enough to actually think. And what have you been thinking about, Miss Vane?" "Whether it is possible for a person to know their own mind completely," she said, "or whether we are all, in some way, strangers to ourselves." Alistair had not expected such an answer from a governess, and he found himself pulling a chair closer, forgetting entirely about the book he had come to retrieve. What began as a brief exchange stretched into nearly 2 hours of conversation, covering philosophy, politics, and the state of the world, subjects he rarely discussed with anyone in his social circle, most of whom preferred gossip and small talk to genuine thought. That night marked the beginning of something neither of them fully understood at the time. Over the following months, their late-night conversations in the library became a quiet, unspoken habit. Alistair found himself looking forward to the evenings in a way he had not anticipated, arranging his schedule so he would be free after the household retired. Eleanor never sought him out directly, never overstepped the boundaries of her position, but she never avoided him either. She spoke to him as an equal, challenged his opinions when she disagreed, and refused to flatter him simply because of his title. It was, he realized much later, the first genuine friendship he had experienced in years. His life before Eleanor had been shaped almost entirely by expectation. As the only son of the Whitmore family, he had been raised to understand that his choices, his marriage, and even his friendships would always be evaluated for their usefulness to the family name. His father, the late Duke, had been a cold and calculating man who valued strategy over affection, and had taught Alistair from a young age that emotions were a weakness to be hidden, not shared. A betrothal arranged in his early 20s had ended badly, when the young woman in question had confessed, quite plainly, that she was more interested in his title than in him as a person. The experience had left him guarded, careful, and quietly convinced that no one would ever want him for anything beyond what he could offer them. Eleanor wanted nothing from him at all. She did not seek his attention, did not flatter his opinions, and on more than one occasion told him plainly when she believed he was wrong. Early in their friendship, during a discussion about tenant farmers on his estate, she had argued passionately that his family's approach to rent collection during difficult harvests was unfair and short-sighted. "You speak boldly for someone in your position," he had said, not unkindly, but with genuine surprise. "Would you prefer I say only what pleases you?" she had asked, raising an eyebrow. "I was under the impression you valued honest conversation, Your Grace, or was I mistaken?" "You were not mistaken," he admitted, and he meant it. Over the following year, their friendship deepened in ways that neither of them spoke aloud but both understood. Alistair began seeking her opinion on estate matters, something he had never done with anyone outside his closest advisors. Eleanor, in turn, began sharing details of her own life, her father's teachings, her mother's early passing, her hopes of one day writing books of her own, rather than simply teaching from them. There were quiet moments that stayed with him long after they happened. The afternoon she had sat beside him in the garden, teaching his young nephew how to identify different types of birds, her patience never wavering despite the boy's constant interruptions. The evening she had found him staring blankly at estate ledgers, overwhelmed by decisions he did not know how to make, and had simply sat beside him without a word, working through the numbers alongside him until the solution became clear. The way she laughed, fully and without restraint, at jokes that no one else in his household seemed to understand. He began to realize, somewhere during that second year, that he no longer thought of her simply as his niece and nephew's governess. He thought of her as someone whose opinion mattered more to him than nearly anyone else's, someone whose presence in a room changed the entire atmosphere of it, someone he found himself missing during the hours she spent teaching, waiting eagerly for evening to arrive so their conversations in the library could resume. The Duchess Helena noticed the change in her son long before he was willing to admit it to himself. "You spend a great deal of time with Miss Vane," she remarked one afternoon, her tone carefully neutral, as she poured tea in the drawing room. "She is an excellent governess," Alistair replied, keeping his own tone equally neutral. "The children have grown fond of her, and their education has improved considerably." "That is not what I asked," his mother said, setting down her teacup with deliberate precision. I asked why you spend so much time with her. Alistair had no answer that satisfied either of them, and the conversation ended there, though it left an uneasy feeling that lingered for days afterward. His mother was not a cruel woman, but she was fiercely protective of the family name, and she had made her expectations for Alistair's future very clear from the moment his father passed away. He was to marry someone of appropriate standing, someone who would strengthen the family's position, someone entirely unlike a governess with no fortune and no title. Alistair told himself for a long time that his feelings for Eleanor were simply friendship, nothing more. It was easier to believe that than to confront what it might mean if they were something else entirely. It was during the second winter of her employment that everything changed. A heavy snowstorm had trapped much of the household indoors for nearly a week, canceling social engagements and confining everyone to Thornbury Hall. On the third night of the storm, Alistair found Eleanor in the library as usual, but this time she seemed unusually quiet, staring into the fireplace rather than reading. Is something troubling you? He asked, taking his usual seat across from her. She hesitated before answering. I received a letter from my brother today. He is taken ill, and I am unable to go to him because of the weather. I am simply worried, that is all. Without thinking, Alistair reached across the small distance between them and took her hand. It was a gesture that crossed every boundary he had carefully maintained for nearly 2 years, and he realized it the moment he did it, but he did not pull away, and neither did she. If the road's clear by morning, he said quietly, I will arrange for you to travel to him immediately. You need not worry about anything else. Eleanor looked at him then, really looked at him, in a way she never had before. Why would you do that for me? Because your happiness matters to me, he said, the words leaving him before he could stop them. More than I think I have been willing to admit. The silence that followed felt heavier than any conversation they had ever shared. Eleanor did not pull her hand away, and for the first time in 2 years, Alistair allowed himself to say plainly what he had felt for months but never spoken aloud. Eleanor, he said softly, I do not know when it happened, or how, but I have come to care for you in a way I did not expect, and cannot ignore any longer. She was quiet for a long moment, her expression difficult to read in the firelight. You are a duke, she finally said, and I am a governess with no fortune to offer you. I am not asking what you can offer me, he said. I am telling you what I feel. That winter, snowed in together with nothing but the fire and each other's company, marked the true beginning of their love, spoken honestly for the first time. Eleanor confessed that she had cared for him for nearly as long as he had cared for her, though she had never allowed herself to believe anything could come of it, given the difference in their stations. They spent the remaining days of the storm in careful, quiet happiness, aware that whatever they had found together would not be easy to protect once the outside world learned of it. By spring, Alistair had made his decision. He intended to marry Eleanor Vane, regardless of what his mother or society expected of him. He began quietly making arrangements, choosing the right moment to speak with her formally, planning how he might explain his decision to his family in a way that would minimize the inevitable conflict. He did not yet understand how much conflict was already forming in the shadows of Thornbury Hall, arranged not by fate, but by his own mother, who had no intention of allowing a governess to become the next Duchess of Thornbury. Spring arrived slowly at Thornbury Hall that year, the frost melting from the gardens, the estate returning to its usual rhythm of visitors, business, and social obligations. Alistair had chosen a night in early April to speak with Eleanor formally, to ask her, at last, to become his wife. He had planned every detail carefully, arranging for the household staff to remain occupied elsewhere, ensuring the garden pavilion where they had first admitted their feelings during a quiet walk months earlier would be free of interruption. What he did not know was that his mother had already set her own plans in motion. The Duchess Helena had watched her son's behavior over the winter with growing alarm. She had noticed the way his eyes followed Eleanor across a room, the way he found excuses to remain in the library long after the household retired, the way his mood had lifted in a manner she had not seen since before his father's passing. At first she told herself it was simply friendship, an innocent attachment that would fade with time, but by early spring she could no longer ignore what was becoming increasingly obvious to anyone who paid attention. Her son intended to marry the governess. For the Duchess, this was not simply a matter of personal disappointment. It was, in her mind, a threat to everything the Whitmore family had built over generations. She had spent her entire life within a rigid understanding of duty, status, and appropriate marriage, and she genuinely believed, without malice but with unshakable conviction, that a marriage between a duke and a governess would bring ruin to the family name. She feared the judgment of society, The whispered scandal that would follow them for years, the damage it might do to the family's standing among the aristocracy they depended upon for influence and connection. She decided to act before her son could make what she believed would be a catastrophic mistake. On the same afternoon Alistair intended to propose that evening, the Duchess summoned Eleanor to her private sitting room. Eleanor arrived believing it was simply a matter concerning the children's education, as such meetings had occurred many times before. She had no reason to suspect what was about to unfold. "Miss Vane," the Duchess began, her tone pleasant but carrying an unmistakable edge, "I believe it is time we spoke plainly, as two women who understand the world as it truly is, rather than as we might wish it to be." Eleanor felt a quiet unease settle over her but kept her expression composed. "Of course, Your Grace. I am aware of my son's feelings toward you," the Duchess said, watching Eleanor closely for any reaction. "And I suspect you are aware of them as well, given how much time the two of you have spent together over these past months." Eleanor's silence was answer enough. "I will not insult your intelligence by pretending this is a simple matter," the Duchess continued. "You are, by all accounts, an intelligent and capable young woman. Under different circumstances, I might have admired you a great deal, but you must understand what a union between you and my son would mean, not simply for him, but for everyone connected to this family." "I have never sought his title," Eleanor said quietly, her voice steady, despite the tightening in her chest. "Whatever feelings exist between us have nothing to do with his position." "Perhaps not for you," the Duchess replied. "But titles and positions are rarely private matters, Miss Vane. My son's inheritance, his standing among his peers, his ability to influence matters that affect hundreds of tenants and families across this estate, all of it depends upon maintaining the respect and cooperation of society. A marriage such as this would be seen as a scandal from which this family may never fully recover." Eleanor felt her hands trembling slightly, though she kept them folded carefully in her lap. "And if he chooses to marry me regardless of these concerns?" The Duchess's expression hardened, though her voice remained deceptively calm. "Then I would be forced to take steps to prevent it, and I do not believe you would want that, Miss Vane, once you understand what those steps might involve." It was then that the Duchess revealed the true weight of her threat. She had, through careful inquiry, learned that Eleanor's younger brother, Edmund, held a modest but stable position as a clerk within a shipping company owned by a business associate of the Whitmore family. It was a position Edmund had worked years to secure, one that supported not only himself but had allowed him to begin saving toward his own small future, perhaps even a family of his own one day. "One word from me," the Duchess said quietly, "and your brother's employment would end immediately, with no reference, no explanation offered to future employers. I understand he has also recently taken ill, which I imagine makes steady income all the more important to your family just now." Eleanor felt the air leave her lungs entirely. "You would ruin an innocent man's livelihood to prevent a marriage that has nothing to do with him?" "I would do a great many things to protect my son's future," the Duchess replied, without hesitation, "including things I take no pleasure in. Do not mistake my willingness for cruelty, Miss Vane. I am simply a mother protecting what matters most to me, in the only way left available to me." The threat did not end there. The Duchess made it clear that beyond Edmund's employment, she would ensure that Eleanor herself would never find respectable work again, not as a governess, not in any household connected to society. Once word spread of what had transpired, she painted a picture of a future not only for Eleanor but for her entire family that would be marked by scandal, poverty, and quiet ruin, all because a governess had dared to fall in love with a duke. "I do not say these things to be unkind," the Duchess said, her voice softening only slightly. "I say them because I believe you care for my son deeply enough to understand what real love sometimes requires. If you truly love him, you will understand that his happiness, in the long term, depends on more than fleeting emotion. It depends on stability, on standing, on a future that a marriage to you simply cannot provide." Eleanor sat in silence for a long moment, her mind racing through every possible option, searching desperately for a way forward that did not involve sacrificing either her love for Alistair or the safety of her family. But the Duchess had chosen her threat carefully, knowing precisely where Eleanor's loyalty would be tested most deeply. "What is it you want me to do?" Eleanor finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Leave Thornbury Hall tonight," the Duchess said, "before my son has the chance to speak whatever plans he has surely made for this evening. Leave without explanation, without a farewell, and never contact him again. In exchange, I will ensure your brother's position remains secure, and I will provide you with enough resources to begin a new life elsewhere, quietly, and without hardship. And if I refuse?" The Duchess's expression did not change. "Then by morning, Your brother will have lost his position, and within a fortnight, every respectable household in this county will know precisely why. I imagine that would make finding future employment for yourself rather difficult as well." Eleanor understood, with painful clarity, that she was not truly being given a choice at all. She thought of Alistair, of the warmth in his eyes when he spoke to her, of the quiet strength he had shown her during the winter storm, when he had held her hand and told her, for the first time, that her happiness mattered to him. She thought of the future they had begun, cautiously and hopefully, to imagine together, and then she thought of her brother, ill and unaware, dependent on the income that kept a roof over his head and medicine within his reach. She could not, in good conscience, allow her own happiness to destroy his stability. "I will need until nightfall to gather my belongings," Eleanor said quietly, her voice steady, despite the devastation building inside her. "You have until nightfall," the Duchess agreed. "And Miss Vane, I would ask that you leave no note, no explanation of any kind. It will be easier for my son, in the long run, to believe you simply left of your own accord than to know the truth of what transpired here today. A clean break will heal faster than a complicated one." What the Duchess did not say, and what Eleanor would only understand much later, was that this final condition was not meant for Alistair's benefit at all. It was meant to ensure that Alistair would never suspect his mother's involvement, never have reason to question or challenge her, never learn the truth that might have changed his understanding of everything that followed. Eleanor returned to her small room within Thornbury Hall that afternoon and began, with trembling hands, to pack the few belongings she had brought with her nearly 2 years earlier. She thought of the garden pavilion where Alistair likely intended to meet her that evening, of the future she had allowed herself, briefly and foolishly, to imagine. She thought of how she would never again sit across from him in the library late at night, never again hear him laugh at one of her sharp observations, never again feel the warmth of his hand holding hers. She allowed herself exactly 1 hour to grieve what she was about to lose, sitting quietly on the edge of her bed with tears she refused to let fall in front of anyone in the household. Then she wiped her eyes, straightened her shoulders, and finished packing. Before she left, she made one quiet request of Mrs. Bell, the housekeeper, who had always shown her kindness during her time at Thornbury Hall. She asked, without explanation, that her name never be spoken again within the household, that no member of staff mention her presence there to the Duke, no matter how many questions he might ask. Mrs. Bell, sensing the depth of pain behind the request though not understanding its cause, agreed without pressing for details. As the sun began to set that evening, Eleanor slipped out through the servants' entrance at the rear of Thornbury Hall, carrying only a small bag containing her most essential belongings. She did not look back at the house that had, for nearly 2 years, felt more like a home than any place she had lived before. She could not allow herself to look back, knowing that if she did, she might lose the courage required to keep walking. Meanwhile, in the garden pavilion, Alistair waited. He had arranged everything carefully, a small bouquet of early spring flowers resting on the stone bench, a ring that had belonged to his grandmother secured safely in his coat pocket. He watched the path leading from the house, his heart racing with anticipation, rehearsing the words he intended to say when Eleanor arrived. But as minutes turned into an hour, and the sky darkened from soft orange to deep blue, Alistair began to feel the first stirrings of unease. She did not come. By the time full darkness had settled over Thornbury Hall, Alistair had walked the garden path 3 times, checked the library twice, and finally made his way to the servants' quarters, something he had never done before, to ask directly whether anyone had seen Eleanor that evening. Mrs. Bell met him at the doorway, her expression carefully composed, though something in her eyes told him instantly that something was deeply wrong. "Your Grace," she said, her voice gentle but firm, "Miss Vane is no longer in residence at Thornbury Hall." Alistair felt as though the ground had shifted beneath him. "What do you mean, no longer in residence? I saw her only this morning. She was teaching the children their lessons." "She departed this evening, Your Grace," Mrs. Bell said, choosing her words with visible care. "I do not know where she has gone." "That cannot be true," Alistair said, his voice rising slightly despite his effort to remain composed. "She would not simply leave without a word. Not without telling me." Mrs. Bell's silence, and the way she could not quite meet his eyes, told him that whatever had happened, she knew more than she was willing to say. But when he pressed her further, she repeated only that Eleanor had asked her privacy be respected, that no further explanation would be offered, and that this was all she was permitted to share. Alistair searched the house that night with an increasingly desperate energy that alarmed the staff who witnessed it. He checked her small room, finding it entirely empty, not a single trace remaining that a person had lived there for nearly 2 years. He checked the library, half hoping, foolishly, that she might be sitting in her usual window seat, waiting for him with an explanation for whatever misunderstanding had occurred. He checked the stables, questioning the grooms about whether any carriages had departed that evening, but received only confused shrugs and vague answers. By midnight, the truth had become undeniable. Eleanor Vane had left Thornbury Hall, and no one, at least no one willing to speak, seemed to know where she had gone or why. Alistair did not sleep that night. He sat alone in the library, the ring still in his coat pocket, staring at the empty window seat where she had once curled up with a book, waiting for a conversation that would now never happen. He replayed every moment of their final days together, searching desperately for some sign he had missed, some indication that she had been planning to leave. He found nothing. Their last conversation, only 2 nights earlier, had been warm and easy, filled with plans, however unspoken, for a future together. Something had happened. Something had changed her mind, or forced her hand, in the space of a single day. But without any explanation, without a single word from Eleanor herself, Alistair was left with nothing but painful speculation. The following weeks brought no answers, only rumors that spread through the household, and eventually through the wider county with cruel efficiency. Some claimed Eleanor had grown bored of her position and sought more exciting opportunities elsewhere. Others whispered that she had been involved with someone else entirely, a secret arrangement that had nothing to do with the Duke at all. A particularly cruel rumor suggested that she had never cared for Alistair genuinely, that her attention toward him had been a calculated attempt to improve her own position, and that she had abandoned the effort once she realized marriage to a duke was an impossible outcome for a governess of her standing. Alistair heard every version of these rumors, and though he told himself he did not believe them, each one added another layer of doubt to the growing wound in his chest. Without any word from Eleanor herself, without any explanation to counter the whispers, he began, slowly and painfully, to wonder whether he had simply misunderstood the depth of her feelings for him entirely. He wrote letters, addressed to her family's modest home in the northern counties, the only address he knew connected to her. Each letter went unanswered. He did not know that Eleanor never received them, that her brother Edmund, following instructions Eleanor had given him before her departure without full explanation, had been told to return any correspondence bearing the Duke's seal without opening it, believing his sister's insistence that this was somehow necessary, for reasons she could not fully explain to him. Eleanor, for her part, spent those same weeks in a state of quiet devastation entirely of her own, though hidden far from Alistair's knowledge. She had traveled first to a small town several counties away, using the resources the Duchess had provided to secure modest lodging, determined to build a new life far from anything that might remind her of what she had lost. She found work eventually as a teacher in a small local school, using the skills she had developed at Thornbury Hall, though nothing about her new position brought her the same sense of purpose or connection she had once felt. She thought of Alistair every single day, wondering what he must think of her sudden disappearance, knowing that whatever conclusions he had drawn, they were surely far from the truth. She had wanted, desperately, to write to him, to explain everything, to beg his understanding and forgiveness. But the Duchess's threat remained a constant weight upon her conscience. She did not know whether the Duchess would follow through on her promise to protect Edmund's position if Eleanor broke her silence, and she could not risk her brother's livelihood, not even for the chance to ease Alistair's pain or her own. So she remained silent, carrying the truth alone, month after month, year after year, watching from a distance as her own heart slowly hardened into something resembling acceptance, though it never fully became peace. Back at Thornbury Hall, Alistair changed in ways that concerned everyone who knew him. The warmth that Eleanor had drawn out of him during their 2 years together seemed to retreat entirely, replaced by the guarded coldness he had known before her arrival, though now amplified by genuine heartbreak rather than simple caution. He threw himself into estate matters with an intensity that left little room for personal relationships. He attended social engagements when required by duty, but avoided any meaningful connection, wary of allowing himself to feel deeply for anyone again, given how badly it had ended the one time he had. His mother, watching her son's transformation, felt a complicated mixture of relief and guilt that she never allowed herself to fully examine. She told herself that his pain would fade with time, that eventually he would find an appropriate match and build the future she had always envisioned for him. She did not anticipate that his pain would harden into something more permanent, a wound that seemed to resist healing no matter how many years passed. It was nearly 6 months after Eleanor's departure that the tradition of the empty chair began. Alistair had been hosting a smaller dinner, primarily family, when his mother had instructed the staff to set the table according to the exact number of confirmed guests. Alistair, without fully understanding his own impulse, had quietly instructed Peter afterward to always set one additional place at his table going forward, regardless of the number of guests attending. When asked why, he offered no explanation beyond a simple statement that it was his preference, and the household staff, sensing the weight behind the request though not fully understanding it, complied without further question. Over time, the empty chair became a fixture of Thornbury Hall, a strange but unquestioned tradition that guests eventually stopped remarking upon, though new visitors always noticed it with quiet curiosity during their first dinner at the estate. Few ever learned the true reason behind it. Alistair certainly never explained it to anyone, not even to his closest friends, who occasionally asked with careful delicacy whether the empty chair held some particular significance. "It is simply a habit," he would say, and the conversation would move elsewhere, though anyone paying close attention might have noticed the slight tightness in his expression whenever the subject arose. Years passed in this manner. Alistair's mother, the Duchess Helena, passed away nearly 2 years after Eleanor's departure, taking the truth of what she had done with her, believing until her final days that she had protected her son from a mistake that would have ruined his future. She never confessed her role in Eleanor's disappearance, not even in her final moments, perhaps believing that some secrets were kinder left buried entirely. Alistair inherited full control of the estate following his mother's passing, and though he mourned her loss genuinely, her death did nothing to ease the deeper wound that had never fully healed. If anything, her passing left him more isolated than before, without even the complicated presence of his mother to occupy his days and distract him from thoughts of Eleanor. He considered marriage on several occasions during those years, as pressure from extended family and society continued to mount regarding the need for an heir. He met several eligible young women, each perfectly suitable by every measure society valued, and yet none of them ever stirred in him the sense of connection he had felt during those 2 years with Eleanor. He found himself comparing every conversation, every quiet moment, to memories of late nights in the library, and inevitably, every comparison left him wanting. By the 3rd year following her departure, Alistair had settled into a life defined largely by routine and duty. He managed his estate with careful competence, attended the social obligations required of his position, and maintained the empty chair at his table each evening, a silent tribute to a wound that had never fully closed, though few around him understood its true meaning. It was on an ordinary evening in early autumn, during a dinner party much like countless others he had hosted over the years, that the letter finally arrived, bearing a seal he had not seen in 3 years, carrying within it truths that would finally begin to unravel the mystery that had shaped so much of his life since Eleanor's sudden and unexplained departure. Alistair sat alone in his study long after his guests had departed that evening. The fire burned low, the house finally settling into the quiet stillness he usually welcomed but tonight found unbearable. The letter remained folded inside his coat pocket, close to his chest, though he had only read the first few lines before duty had pulled him away. He removed it now with careful hands, unfolding the worn paper beneath the lamplight, and began reading from the beginning once more, determined this time to reach the very end no matter what truths awaited him there. "My dearest Alistair," the letter began, "if you are reading this, then I have finally found the courage I lacked 3 years ago. I do not know if this letter will bring you comfort or pain, and I have hesitated many times over these past months, before finally deciding that you deserve the truth, regardless of what it might cost either of us now. I did not leave Thornbury Hall because I stopped loving you. I did not leave because I found someone else, or grew tired of my position, or believed our future together was impossible on my own terms. I left because your mother gave me no other choice, and because the alternative she presented was one I could not, in good conscience, allow to happen." Alistair's hands tightened around the paper as he continued reading, his heart pounding with a mixture of relief and growing horror at what he suspected was coming. "On the very afternoon you intended to propose, your mother summoned me to her sitting room and made her position entirely clear. She had learned of your feelings for me, and of mine for you, and she believed, with complete conviction, that a marriage between us would bring ruin to your family's standing and your future prospects. I tried to explain that I sought nothing from you beyond your affection, that I had never cared for your title or position, but she made it clear that my intentions mattered little compared to the consequences she believed such a marriage would bring. She threatened my brother's livelihood, Alistair. Edmund's position, the only stable income supporting our small family, would be destroyed entirely, with no reference and no explanation offered to future employers, the moment she learned we intended to marry. Beyond this, she promised that my own reputation would be ruined so thoroughly that I would never find respectable work again, anywhere within society's reach. She painted a future not only for myself but for my entire family marked by poverty and scandal, all because I had fallen in love with a man whose station in life differed so greatly from my own. I want you to understand that I did not leave easily, or without grief. I spent nearly an hour alone in my room that afternoon, grieving the future we had begun to imagine together, before I found the strength to pack my belongings and walk away from the only place that had ever truly felt like home to me. I asked that no one speak my name to you afterward, not out of indifference, but because I believed, foolishly perhaps, that a clean break would allow you to heal more quickly than a complicated one filled with unanswered questions. I was wrong about many things during those difficult days, Alistair, but I was never wrong about my love for you. Every day since I left Thornbury Hall, I have thought of you. Every night, wherever I have found myself living, I have wondered whether you understood any part of the truth, or whether you believed, as I feared you might, that I simply abandoned you without cause. The letter continued, describing the years that followed her departure with painful honesty. She wrote of the small town where she had eventually settled, of the modest position as a teacher she had built for herself, of the quiet, uneventful life she had constructed in an effort to move forward despite carrying the weight of what she had sacrificed. She wrote of her brother Edmund, whose position had indeed remained secure, exactly as the Duchess had promised, though Eleanor had never told him the full truth of why she had disappeared so suddenly from Thornbury Hall, allowing him to believe only that she had simply decided to pursue new opportunities elsewhere. I did not write to you sooner, the letter continued, because I feared what might happen if your mother learned I had broken my silence. I did not know whether her promise to protect Edmund's position depended upon my continued absence from your life, and I could not risk his stability, not even for the chance to ease whatever pain my silence may have caused you. It was only after learning, through a distant acquaintance, that your mother had passed away nearly a year ago, that I began to consider reaching out to you at last. Even then, I hesitated for many months, uncertain whether reopening old wounds would bring you any comfort, or whether it would be kinder to allow the past to remain buried. Alistair paused in his reading, his throat tight with emotion, understanding now with painful clarity the full weight of what had happened 3 years earlier. His mother, in her determination to protect what she believed was his best interest, had orchestrated the destruction of the one genuine connection he had found in his adult life, and had done so with such careful precision that he had spent 3 years believing himself abandoned rather than protected. He continued reading, and the final section of the letter brought a new and different kind of pain entirely. I must tell you something else, Alistair, something I have debated including in this letter for many weeks. My health has not been strong these past several months. A persistent illness, one the local doctor here has struggled to fully diagnose, has left me increasingly weakened, and though I try to remain hopeful, I find myself thinking more and more of things left unsaid, of truths left unspoken, of a life I once imagined that I never allowed myself the chance to pursue. I do not write this to burden you with guilt, or to suggest that you bear any responsibility for circumstances entirely outside your control. I write it because I believe you deserve to know the truth, in full, regardless of what may come after. I have spent 3 years wondering whether you found happiness elsewhere, whether the empty space I left in your life was eventually filled by someone more suited to your position, and I find I can no longer bear not knowing. If this letter reaches you and you find in your heart that too much time has passed, that the wound I caused, however unwillingly, has healed into something that no longer requires reopening, I will understand completely, and I will hold no anger toward you for choosing your own peace over uncertain reunion. But if some part of you still wonders, as I do every single day, what might have been, then I would ask only this. Know that I never stopped loving you. Know that the 2 years we shared remain the happiest of my entire life, regardless of everything that followed. And know that wherever I am, whatever time remains for me, some part of my heart has always remained at Thornbury Hall, sitting across from you at that table, in whatever chair you chose to leave for me. The letter ended with an address, a small town several counties north of Thornbury Hall, and a final line that struck Alistair harder than anything else he had read that evening. With all the love I was never permitted to properly show you, Eleanor. Alistair sat in silence for a long time after finishing the letter, the fire in his study nearly extinguished, the house around him utterly still. 3 years of pain, confusion, and carefully guarded grief suddenly made complete sense, reframed entirely by a truth he had never once suspected. His mother, whom he had mourned genuinely despite their complicated relationship, had deliberately destroyed his chance at happiness, believing until her final days that she had acted in his best interest. He felt anger, sharp and immediate, at the manipulation that had shaped so much of his life over the past 3 years. He felt grief, renewed and painful, for the years he and Eleanor had lost, years they might have spent together had circumstances been different. And beneath both of these emotions, he felt something else entirely, something he had not allowed himself to feel in a very long time. Hope. Eleanor was alive. She had never stopped loving him. And somewhere, several counties north of where he now sat, she was waiting, uncertain whether he would ever receive her letter, uncertain whether 3 years of silence had permanently severed whatever connection they had once shared. But her mention of illness, however brief and carefully worded, sent a fresh wave of urgency through him. He did not know how serious her condition truly was, whether the doctors she mentioned had offered any hope of recovery, or whether time was a luxury they could not afford to waste. Alistair rose from his desk, the letter still clutched tightly in his hand, and moved toward the window, staring out into the dark grounds of Thornbury Hall, the same grounds where he had once waited in a garden pavilion for a proposal that never came to pass. He thought of the empty chair still sitting at his dinner table, a tradition maintained for 3 years without his household ever understanding its true purpose. He would not maintain that tradition much longer. Whatever it took, whatever distance needed to be traveled, whatever conversations needed to happen, Alistair intended to see Eleanor Vane again, and this time, no one, not his family's expectations, not society's judgment, not even his own long-buried fear of vulnerability, would stand in his way. He called for Higgins immediately, his voice carrying an urgency the butler had not heard from him in years. "Prepare the carriage," Alistair said. "I leave for the northern counties at first light." The journey north took 2 full days, longer than Alistair would have liked, but the roads leading toward the small town mentioned in Eleanor's letter were rough and poorly maintained, forcing the carriage to slow considerably in several stretches. He barely slept during the journey, his mind circling endlessly between hope and fear, imagining 100 different versions of how their reunion might unfold. He thought of what he might say to her, how he might explain that he had only just learned the truth, how he might apologize for 3 years of silence that had never truly been her fault at all. He worried about her health, wondering how serious her illness truly was, whether the doctors in this small town possessed the skill or resources necessary to help her, whether he had arrived too late or with enough time still remaining to matter. By the time the carriage finally rolled into the outskirts of the small town on the second evening, Alistair felt a nervous energy he had not experienced since his youngest years, long before duty and grief had hardened him into the guarded man he had become. The town itself was modest, a collection of stone cottages and small shops nestled along a quiet main road, with rolling hills visible in the distance beneath a darkening sky. He asked the carriage driver to stop at the first respectable inn they encountered, intending to seek directions toward the address mentioned in Eleanor's letter. The innkeeper, an older woman with kind eyes, recognized the address immediately when Alistair inquired. "That would be Miss Vane's cottage," she said, studying him with quiet curiosity. "Just past the schoolhouse, at the edge of town. Are you a relation of hers, sir?" "A friend," Alistair said, his voice tighter than he intended. "An old friend." The innkeeper's expression softened slightly, though something in her eyes suggested she knew more than she was willing to share with a stranger. "She has not been teaching at the schoolhouse these past few weeks," she said carefully. "Her health has not permitted it." Alistair's chest tightened at the confirmation of what he had feared since reading the letter. "Is she very unwell?" The innkeeper hesitated before answering. "The doctor visits regularly. I do not know the particulars, sir, only that the whole town has grown concerned for her. She is well liked here, you understand. Kind to everyone, especially the children she teaches." Alistair thanked the woman and immediately requested directions, unwilling to wait another moment longer than necessary. Despite the late hour and his own exhaustion from 2 days of travel, he set out on foot toward the edge of town, following the innkeeper's directions past the small schoolhouse Eleanor had described in her letter, toward a modest cottage nestled among a small cluster of similar homes. The cottage was smaller than anything Eleanor had ever known at Thornbury Hall, its stone walls simple and unadorned, a small garden visible beside the front door, clearly tended with care despite whatever illness had recently limited her ability to work. A single candle burned in the front window, casting a warm glow against the gathering darkness. Alistair stood outside the cottage for a long moment, his heart pounding, uncertain suddenly how to proceed after 3 years of separation and so much unspoken truth between them. He thought of every conversation they had once shared in the library at Thornbury Hall, every quiet moment that had built the foundation of a love he had never fully allowed himself to release, even during the years he believed she had abandoned him without cause. He raised his hand and knocked gently on the cottage door. For a long moment, there was no response, and Alistair felt a fresh wave of fear that perhaps he had arrived too late, that whatever illness had claimed her strength had progressed further than he understood. But then he heard soft footsteps approaching from within, and the door opened slowly to reveal a face he had spent 3 years trying, unsuccessfully, to forget. Eleanor stood before him, thinner than he remembered, her face paler, though her eyes retained the same sharp intelligence and warmth that had first drawn him to her nearly 5 years earlier. For a moment, neither of them spoke, both simply staring at each other across the threshold, as though uncertain whether the other was truly real or merely a figure conjured by long-held longing. "Alistair," Eleanor finally whispered, her voice trembling with disbelief. "You came." "I read your letter," he said, his own voice thick with emotion he could no longer contain. "Eleanor, I did not know. I swear to you, I did not know what my mother had done. If I had known even a fraction of the truth, I would have come to find you the very next day, and every day after that, for 3 years." Tears filled Eleanor's eyes as she stepped back from the doorway, silently inviting him inside. The cottage was small but warm, a fire burning gently in the hearth, simple furniture arranged with the same careful thoughtfulness Alistair remembered from her presence at Thornbury Hall, even in circumstances far more modest than the grand estate she had once called home. "I did not know if the letter would even reach you," Eleanor said, gesturing for him to sit as she lowered herself carefully into a chair near the fire, moving with the deliberate slowness of someone conserving limited strength. "I did not know if you would want to hear from me at all, after so much time and silence." "I set a chair for you every single night," Alistair said quietly, sitting across from her. "For 3 years, Eleanor. I did not fully understand why, not consciously, but some part of me refused to accept that you were truly gone from my life. I told myself it was foolish sentiment, but I could never bring myself to stop." Eleanor's hand rose to cover her mouth, tears now falling freely down her cheeks. "I thought of Thornbury Hall every single day," she admitted. "I thought of you, of our conversations in the library, of the winter we spent together before everything fell apart. I never stopped loving you, Alistair, not for a single moment, despite everything your mother threatened." They spent the following hours in careful, emotional conversation, filling in the gaps of 3 lost years, each explaining what they had endured separately, apart from the connection that had once brought them such profound happiness. Alistair explained the rumors that had spread through Thornbury Hall following her departure, the pain and confusion he had carried for years, believing himself abandoned rather than protected by her sacrifice. Eleanor explained her years in this small town, her work as a teacher, the quiet, uneventful life she had built while carrying the weight of loss and unspoken truth every single day. "Your health," Alistair finally said, unable to avoid the question that had weighed on him since receiving her letter. "Eleanor, what is truly happening? Please, tell me honestly." Eleanor hesitated before answering, her hands folding carefully in her lap. "The local doctor believes it is an illness of the lungs, something that has weakened me considerably over these past several months. He is not entirely certain of the cause, or of how much time it may allow me, though he has been honest that my condition requires careful attention and rest." Alistair felt his chest tighten with fear, but he refused to allow despair to take hold entirely. "Then we will find better care," he said firmly. "Thornbury Hall has access to physicians far beyond what a small town can offer. I will bring you home, Eleanor, and we will find every possible means of helping you recover." "Alistair," Eleanor said gently, though her expression carried a flicker of hope she had not allowed herself in a very long time. "You cannot simply bring a governess back into your household after 3 years of silence. Your family, your position, society itself, will have questions neither of us can easily answer." "I do not care what society thinks," Alistair said, his voice carrying a conviction that surprised even himself. "I have spent 3 years living according to expectation, maintaining a household that felt empty despite being filled with guests every single evening. I set an empty chair at my table for 3 years because some part of me refused to accept a life without you in it. I am done pretending that duty matters more than genuine happiness, Eleanor. I want you home, not as my household's governess, but as my wife, if you will still have me after everything that has happened." Eleanor's tears returned, though this time they carried a different kind of emotion entirely, one filled with hope rather than grief. "You truly still wish to marry me, even now, even with my health uncertain, even knowing the scandal it may bring to your family's name?" "Especially now," Alistair said, reaching across the small distance between them to take her hand, just as he had done years earlier during that snowstorm that had first revealed their feelings for each other. "I have already lost 3 years I can never reclaim. I refuse to lose whatever time remains ahead of us, however much or little that may be, simply because society expects me to value position over love." That evening, as the fire burned low in the small cottage, Alistair and Eleanor spoke honestly and openly for the first time in 3 years, rebuilding, piece by piece, the connection that had once made an entire estate feel like home, despite everything that had tried to keep them apart. Alistair remained in the small town for several days, arranging for a respected physician from a nearby city to examine Eleanor thoroughly, determined to understand the full nature of her illness before making any decisions about travel or treatment. The physician's assessment, delivered after careful examination, brought cautious relief rather than the devastating news Alistair had feared. Eleanor's condition, while serious, was not immediately life-threatening, though it required consistent care, proper rest, and treatment that the physician believed could improve significantly with time and the right resources. The stress and exhaustion of maintaining her small teaching position while managing her declining health alone had likely worsened her condition considerably, and with proper support, genuine recovery remained a realistic possibility. Relieved by this news, though still cautious, Alistair made arrangements to bring Eleanor back to Thornbury Hall, this time not in secret, not through careful planning designed to avoid his family's scrutiny, but openly and without apology. He informed his extended family of his intentions before their departure north was even complete, sending letters that made his position entirely clear. The reaction, as expected, was mixed. Some relatives expressed genuine concern about the scandal such a marriage might bring, echoing sentiments similar to those his late mother had once held. Others, particularly his cousin Edward, who had long suspected the truth behind Alistair's guarded heartbreak over the years, offered genuine support, relieved to see some warmth finally returning to a man who had spent 3 years hardened by unexplained grief. Alistair addressed the concerns of his family directly and firmly during a gathering held shortly after his return to Thornbury Hall with Eleanor at his side. "I understand the concerns many of you hold," he said, standing before assembled relatives in the same drawing room where countless dinner parties had once ended with guests speculating quietly about an empty chair whose meaning they never understood. "I understand that society may judge this decision harshly, that some among you believe a marriage between myself and Eleanor threatens the standing our family has worked generations to build. But I have spent 3 years living according to those very expectations, and I have found that position and title mean very little when weighed against genuine happiness and love." He turned to look at Eleanor, seated beside him, her health visibly improving already after only a few weeks of proper rest and care within Thornbury Hall's comfortable walls. "Eleanor Vane is the only person who has ever known me completely, who challenged me honestly rather than flattering me for my title, who cared for my happiness without any interest in what I could offer her beyond genuine affection. I lost 3 years with her because of decisions made without my knowledge or consent, decisions I can never fully forgive, though I understand they were made from a place of misguided protection rather than cruelty. I refuse to lose any more time simply because tradition demands it." The room remained silent for a long moment before his cousin Edward rose from his seat, offering a warm smile that carried genuine support. "Then I, for one, welcome Miss Vane to this family," he said, "and I look forward to finally understanding why that empty chair has haunted every dinner at Thornbury Hall for the past 3 years." Slowly, one by one, other family members offered their own cautious acceptance, some more readily than others, though none openly opposed a decision Alistair had made clear was final, regardless of their approval. Society, as expected, offered its share of whispered judgment and scandal in the weeks that followed, though Alistair found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he genuinely did not care. The years of guarded loneliness had taught him precisely how little comfort position and reputation truly offered, when weighed against the warmth of genuine connection. Eleanor's recovery continued steadily over the following months, supported by proper medical care, rest, and an environment finally free from the fear and uncertainty that had shadowed her for 3 long years. Her relationship with Alistair deepened once again, rebuilding trust and connection that had never truly disappeared, only been forced into painful separation by circumstances entirely outside either of their control. On a quiet evening nearly 6 months after their reunion, Alistair hosted a dinner at Thornbury Hall, unlike any that had come before it. The table was set, as always, with an additional chair beyond the confirmed number of guests, a tradition the household staff had long grown accustomed to without ever understanding its meaning. But this time, as the final course was served and conversation flowed warmly among gathered family and friends, the empty chair finally found its occupant. Eleanor Vane, dressed elegantly, though still carrying the same warmth and sharp intelligence that had first captured Alistair's heart years earlier, took her seat beside him at the head of the table, no longer as governess, but as his wife. For the first time in 3 years, every chair at Alistair's table was filled. Life at Thornbury Hall settled into a new rhythm in the months that followed the wedding, one built not on careful duty and guarded distance, but on the genuine warmth that had once flourished quietly within the walls of a library, years before either of them had allowed themselves to admit what they truly felt. Eleanor's health continued to improve steadily under proper care, and within a year, The fragile woman who had once opened her cottage door to a duke she never expected to see again had regained much of her former strength, though she carried the experience of those difficult years with a quiet grace that shaped the person she had become. Alistair, too, had changed in ways that extended far beyond his personal happiness. The guarded coldness that had defined his years of separation from Eleanor gradually gave way to a warmth that surprised even those who had known him since childhood. He became more generous in his dealings with tenants and staff, more willing to listen rather than simply command, more present in conversations rather than distracted by memories he could no longer bear to examine. Those who had known him only during his years of quiet grief hardly recognized the man he became once genuine happiness had finally returned to his life. Edmund, Eleanor's brother, whose secure employment had once been the very reason for her painful silence, eventually learned the full truth of what his sister had sacrificed on his behalf. He arrived at Thornbury Hall several months after the wedding, overwhelmed with gratitude and quiet guilt that he had unknowingly been the reason behind 3 years of separation between two people who loved each other so deeply. "You should have told me," he said to Eleanor during a quiet conversation in the same garden where Alistair had once waited alone, with a ring meant for a proposal that never happened. "I would have found another position. I would have managed somehow. You did not need to sacrifice your own happiness for my sake." Eleanor took her brother's hand gently, shaking her head with the same quiet strength that had carried her through those difficult years. "I made my choice knowing full well what it might cost me," she said. "I do not regret protecting you, Edmund. I only regret that it took so long for the truth to finally find its way to where it belonged." The story of the Duke and his governess, once whispered about in tones of scandal and speculation, gradually transformed into something else entirely within the county's social circles. What had once been dismissed as an inappropriate match between a man of high standing and a woman of modest means became, over time, a story told with genuine admiration, an example of love that had survived deliberate separation, cruel circumstance, and years of painful silence, only to find its way back together against every expectation society had placed upon it. Thornbury Hall itself seemed to reflect the change that had taken place within its walls, where once the estate had felt grand but hollow, filled with guests and obligations but lacking genuine warmth. It now became known throughout the county as a place of unusual openness and hospitality. Alistair and Eleanor hosted gatherings that welcomed conversation and genuine connection, rather than rigid social performance, and slowly, other families throughout the county began to follow their example, finding that authenticity, rather than strict adherence to expectation, brought far greater satisfaction to their own lives as well. Nearly 2 years after their reunion, Eleanor gave birth to their first child, a daughter they named Margaret, after Alistair's late sister, whose passing had originally brought Eleanor into their lives as governess to her children. The birth was met with genuine celebration throughout Thornbury Hall, staff and family alike rejoicing in the continuation of a love story that had once seemed destined for permanent separation. As their daughter grew, Eleanor found herself, quite unexpectedly, returning to the very skills that had first brought her into Alistair's life. She began teaching Margaret personally during her early years, just as she had once taught Alistair's nephew and niece, finding in motherhood a purpose that complemented rather than replaced the intellectual passion that had always defined her character. She eventually began writing as well, the very ambition she had once confessed to Alistair during their earliest conversations in the library, publishing several works under a modest pen name that gained quiet but genuine appreciation among readers who valued thoughtful, honest writing over dramatic flourish. The empty chair tradition, once a symbol of unbearable loss maintained without full understanding of its own significance, transformed into something entirely different within the household's memory. Alistair eventually shared the full story with his own children as they grew older, explaining how a single chair, kept empty for 3 years out of quiet, unconscious hope, had ultimately led to the reunion that shaped their entire family's happiness. "Sometimes," he would tell them, "the heart understands truths the mind refuses to accept. I did not know why I could not remove that chair from my table, not truly, not until the day your mother's letter finally arrived. But some part of me always believed, even during the darkest years of doubt, that she would return to fill it eventually." Eleanor, listening to these retellings with quiet warmth, would often add her own perspective, reminding their children of the deeper lesson behind the story they had inherited. Love built on genuine understanding rarely disappears entirely, even when circumstances force separation, she would say. It waits, patiently, for truth to find its way back to where it belongs, no matter how long that journey may take. The Duchess Helena's role in the years of separation remained a complicated subject within the family's private history. Alistair never fully forgave his mother's actions, understanding as he did the pain and confusion her manipulation had caused both himself and Eleanor over those 3 lost years. Yet with time, and with the genuine happiness he had finally found, he came to understand, if not fully forgive, the fear that had driven her decision. She had acted from a place of misguided protection rather than cruelty, however devastating the consequences of her choices had ultimately been. Eleanor, for her part, harbored less resentment toward the late Duchess than Alistair himself carried, perhaps because she had witnessed firsthand the genuine anguish behind the woman's threats, recognizing even in that painful conversation years earlier that the Duchess believed, however wrongly, that she was protecting her son's future rather than destroying his happiness. She was wrong, Eleanor would say when the subject arose, but I do not believe she acted out of hatred. She acted out of fear, and fear often leads people toward decisions they later cannot undo, even when they come to understand the harm those decisions caused. As years passed, Thornbury Hall welcomed 2 more children into the family, each raised within an environment far removed from the rigid coldness that had once defined Alistair's own upbringing under his father, and, later, the careful manipulation of his well-meaning but misguided mother. Alistair made a conscious effort to raise his children differently, valuing open communication and genuine emotional connection over the strict adherence to duty and appearance that had shaped so much of his own difficult path toward happiness. The empty chair, once a nightly reminder of unbearable loss, eventually became simply another cherished tradition within a household now overflowing with genuine warmth and connection. Guests who visited Thornbury Hall in later years often remarked upon the unusual custom of setting an extra place at every dinner, and Alistair, no longer guarded about the story behind it, would share the tale freely, describing how 3 years of quiet, unconscious hope had ultimately led to the greatest happiness he had ever known. Eleanor Vane, once a governess with no fortune or title to offer, had become far more than simply the Duchess of Thornbury. She had become the very heart of the household, the person whose presence had transformed a grand but hollow estate into a genuine home, filled not with careful performance and rigid expectation, but with honest laughter, thoughtful conversation, and love that had proven strong enough to survive even deliberate separation and years of painful silence. Their story, once shaped by manipulation, fear, and painful misunderstanding, ultimately became a testament to a different kind of truth entirely, one that Alistair often reflected upon during quiet evenings spent in the same library where their connection had first begun so many years earlier. Love, genuine and honest, rarely disappears simply because circumstance demands its absence. It waits, patiently, in empty chairs and unanswered letters, in quiet hope carried silently across years of separation, until truth finally finds the courage to reveal itself, and 2 hearts long kept apart are finally, and permanently, allowed to find their way home to each other.